this afternoon. This is Ian's fourth technique talk, so hopefully he needs a little introduction. From the feedback and the requests for more, he must have been doing something right. Today he's looking at the world of monochrome and how to get the best out of your nature images if you choose to use this genre. Please could you direct all your questions to me on the chat, and then at the end I'll go through them and present as many as I can to Ian. So over to Ian.
Thank you very much, Anne. Again, yes, as I say, yeah, I think I'm going to say this is now his fourth, so maybe I'll get it right this time. But anyway, we'll see. Right, hang on a second. Let me see if I can share my screen. If I go like that and I go share, right, you should all be seeing two handsome dogs. Yes or no?
Yes,
thank you.
Oh, right, that's it. We've spent the entire time looking at two dogs. Excellent. That's fine.
They are black and white.
Yeah, indeed, we have a black one and a white one. This is true. Very, very good point. Okay, right. I'm glad Anne suggested this. For monochrome nature, it's not essentially because it's not necessarily the first choice that you would think of when doing processing for nature. It's perfect, in my view, certainly it's perfectly legitimate, and in many times it's really appropriate. You get some effects in black and white that you simply cannot achieve in colour. There are some maybe who are perhaps more purist who say that nature should just be as is or as seen, but for me they're missing a trick. I think so anyway. The thing about going to monochrome is it allows simplification. You know, you really are removing a complete level of complexity from the image by taking the color away. And it allows you to contrast, to look at contrast, essentially, to look at light, to look at dark, and to look at texture. There's no surprising some of the images we're going to be playing with today. They've got quite a bit of texture in them. And that's one of the things that monochrome is particularly good for. I think probably one of the most important things for me anyway is that it allows a modicum of interpretation. The thing about doing, I actually really enjoy doing straight nature processing. There's something very nice about working within that, I wouldn't say straitjacket, but within that framework. But going to monochrome, you're allowed a little bit more leeway in terms of artistic interpretation or being able to interpret an image, and that's really quite nice. As far as I'm concerned, it's a way of working entirely in its own right. I know there are some people who see it as a way of resurrecting what one might call colour failures, things that don't work in colour, and there's we'll try it in monochrome then. I think that does it an injustice. It's certainly not just a question of trying to make a silk purse from a sow's ear. Some images work equally well in monochrome as they do in colour. It's just a matter of down to personal preference and how you choose to present your pictures. So let's jump in. I'll just give you, as always, a little bit of background. And this is a lovely image. I love this image. It's not strictly nature, on the grounds that it was shot under controlled conditions. And the other thing is, these are not wild oranges. These are captive oranges, Waitrose best. But the important thing is, I just wanted to show this. This is an illustration of something really important, which is that a monochrome picture is absolutely not a color picture with the color taken away. Very, very rarely does that actually give you anything worthwhile. And I'll just here we've got something really obvious. We've got three oranges sitting on a blue background. And because orange and blue are opposites on the pigment color wheel, the oranges stand out superbly from the background. And if I were to take something like a hue saturation layer here, and I were to take the saturation and I were to knock it down to 0, you suddenly find that the oranges and the background have exactly the same brightness. The only thing that's making those oranges stand out from the background is the color. And as a result, by removing the color, what you're left with is just gray mush. And so it's very, very rare that simply taking the color away from something actually gives you an interesting monochrome picture. It just doesn't work that way. All right, so let's forget that one. So just simple desaturation is never going to give you a good result. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start off. I'm going to work in Photoshop. We're going to work in Lightroom. If I remember, we're going to work in Camera Raw just to show that it's completely identical to working in Lightroom. And towards the end, I'm going to move, or a bit later on, I'm going to move into silver effects, which is probably my favorite way of doing monochrome conversion. But we'll start off in Photoshop because, in my view, it's probably the least satisfactory of all of them in terms of actually doing monochrome conversions. It's only relatively recently in geological time that I actually put a proper monochrome converter into Photoshop. It didn't exist before that. You had to use a horrible thing called the channel mixer, which was dreadful. There is now a black and white adjustment layer, which you can start. And it starts with it's slightly better than default. But the important thing is, it demonstrates something which is basically the way that most monochrome converters work, in that they give you a set of color sliders. And essentially what they're doing here is they are translating color into tone. That's the basic principle. So if you have, for example, we know that the background was blue. All right, we happen to know that one. So if I take the blue slider and I move it to the left, it is going to turn anything which is blue to a darker tone. And if I move it to the right, it's going to turn everything that was blue to a brighter tone. All right. Now, oranges. Oranges are orange. We don't have an orange slider here, so we can try the red slider. Yeah, the red slider sort of does things. We can try the yellow slider. Oh, the yellow slider does things too. Yeah, sometimes you're not quite sure which color sliders to go for. This is one of the problems of this kind of setup. However, you do have an option here, and the option here is this strange thing called, what I call it the finger. Adobe call it the targeted adjustment tool. And we're about to demonstrate that Adobe are utterly inconsistent in the way they implement this kind of thing. In that this thing here, you can see it's a finger, and I don't know if you can see there's a couple of little arrows pointing left and right. So if you click on that, it's now active. You can see that because it's gone dark. If I now click anywhere on the picture, what it does is it samples the color there, chooses the appropriate slider, and then I can move that slider. If I drag my mouse left and right, it drags the appropriate slider left and right. All right, that's fine. Now remember that the oranges were being moved both by the red slider and the yellow slider. So if I click somewhere there, note that it only moves the red one. And if I click somewhere else, note that it only moves the orange to the yellow one. All right, now that is actually pretty poor. Yeah, these really are, the cut-offs between these different colors really are absolute, and there's no concept of overlap. So that makes this control actually quite difficult to use, I think. But anyway, that obviously, if you're an entirely Photoshop user, give it a try, see how you get on. If you like presets, you have an option up here at the top, presets. So you can pretend you're back in good old-fashioned film days, and you're shooting your black and white film through a blue filter, for example, which of course is going to turn anything blue very bright and anything which isn't blue very dark. So you can go with a green filter, or you can go with a red filter, or something like that. I did try this earlier. You could even, if you're not an engineer, obviously engineers don't do this, but if you're not an engineer, you can even hit the auto button. And as you can see, Adobe make a complete dog's breakfast of this particular image. That is really good, don't you think? No, maybe not. Let's just reset that one. So the default might or might not give you reasonable results. So basic principles are there. The fact that you've got a set of color sliders, those color sliders translate from colors to tones, and there's usually a way of sampling the color and turning that into the appropriate slider. All right, so that is basically Photoshop's way of doing black and white conversion, and it's really, I don't think it's particularly good, I have to say. I think there are much better ways of doing it. So let's just drop back into Lightroom on the grounds that we know that's really where we're going to be working most of the time. So if I now go to the Develop module in Lightroom, and I go to, if I wanted to convert this to monochrome, for a start, all you have to do is find that within the very top of the basic panel, you'll find a couple of words you can click: color or black and white, two different treatments, and they're mutually exclusive. You're either color or you're black and white. In this case, I'm going to click black and white. Okay, it's already giving you something slightly different. It's using a different algorithm for converting from tones, from colors to tones, right? Now, here's where it starts to get much more interesting, because we are working in a raw converter. And as you know, when you're working in a raw converter from a camera, you have a choice of profiles. You can start off with a different color profile, which will interpret the raw picture in front of you and turn it into something else. And it's just as true for monochrome as it is for colors. So in this case, you can click on these four rectangles up here, and that will take me into the profile browser. If I then go down to the various black and white ones, whoops, of course I've hidden that one. You can hover your mouse over the different ones and it will give you a preview. So 06 is looking quite good. Let's try 07. Yeah, 07 is quite good. 08 and so on. Yeah, so you can choose the one that gives you the best starting point. It's just like it is when you're processing a color picture. Give yourself the best starting point. So there we are. Let's close that now. So that's already giving us a good starting point. You've then got all the other controls that you have within the raw converter, obviously things like exposure and contrast and shadows and all that kind of stuff. But down here, what used to be the hue, saturation and luminance control has now become a black and white control. And note that we now no longer have 6 sliders, we have 9. So in addition to all the primaries, red, green and blue, the secondaries, cyan, magenta and yellow, we also now have orange, aqua and purple. So 3 extra colors, but there's something else which is more important as well. Okay, big difference here. Note we no longer have a hand, we have a bullseye, and note that the arrows now go up and down rather than left and right, just to irritate you. Don't ask me why they're different, I have absolutely no idea. Now, if I click on that, and now I'd say I want to make those oranges lighter or darker, I can click on that, and note that it's moving both the orange and the red slider. All right, so this is significantly more sophisticated. If there is a color overlap, then, like for example here, I'm moving the background, that is changing the blue and the purple sliders. So it's much more sophisticated in terms of how it's handling color, how it's determining color. Right, and that's quite important. So this is already a significantly better way of converting from one color to another, from color to monochrome. Okay, I'm not going to waste too much time on this one, but you get the general idea. So this is the same principle as Photoshop, but significantly better. Now, some images, let's look at this one. Again, it's not strictly a nature picture because it was taken in a sunflower field, cultivated sunflower field. But this is the kind of image that works really well using that kind of technique, because we've got very strong colors and very strong differentials between those colors. So I can trivially here go to the black and white. I can say I want to convert this to black and white. It's a pretty boring conversion as it stands. Go and have a look and see if we can find a... Let's find one that works. So 6 works okay. 7 again works really well. No, 8 doesn't. So it's going to be 6 or 7, isn't it? Again, 7. Yeah, it's going to be down to the individual image as to which one of these actually works best. So I'm going to choose 7. All right. Now we're going to go down to black and white. Same thing as before. Click on that one. I want to give this image some more punch, so I'm going to click on the blue sky. I want the blue sky to be slightly darker. I want the yellows to be slightly brighter. But let's say I wanted to do something to this post. Let's say I wanted to make this post darker or something, and I click somewhere in there and I drag it down. Now note what's happening. It's affecting both the post and the center of the flower. And this is one of the downsides of this technique, which is that it's all working globally. So if you've got something else in the picture that happens to be the same color as the one that you're adjusting, it will be affected too. Now what that means is if you're going to do this kind of conversion in something like Lightroom or Photoshop, you've then got to go in and do some some of your own selective adjustments later. So if I wanted, for example, to make that post darker, but I did not want the center of the flower to be quite so dark, then what I then need to do is go in with the adjustment brush here. And let's say I want to push the exposure up, say, and I want to push the contrast up, and maybe I want to add a bit more clarity, which is kind of micro contrast. That works really well with monochrome. So I'm just going to paint that in. So I'm just going to paint that area in. So now I'm just going to paint over those areas. Okay, I'm doing this very roughly. You're getting the idea, I hope. The point I'm trying to get across is you need to be very, very careful, because this is entirely working globally and translating colors to tones. So if you happen to have two things with the same color, they will end up mapping into the same tone, whether you like it or not. Okay. So, which colors are affected by which of the sliders? Now, this is just it's a bit difficult to see, but that is a color wheel. It's a square wheel. Nothing wrong with having a square wheel, but that is the color wheel: red, opposite red, cyan, and so on. It's much easier to start off with something like this, and this is an image I'll make available for everyone. It's courtesy of Wikipedia anyway, but this is a really, really useful thing to play with, just to give you an idea of what each of these sliders is actually doing, because the different triangles here are actually labeled, the colors are labeled. So for example, what I can do now is if I go and turn that to black and white, now I can go to my black and white slider and I can move the red slider and see what happens. And I can see that the red slider is essentially affecting the reds and the pinks, and a little bit the oranges. Okay. If I move the orange slider is affecting the oranges, but it's affecting the reds almost as much, but it's not affecting the yellows. Similarly, I can go to the yellow slider. The yellow slider is really affecting only the yellows. Okay, green, on the other hand, is also affecting the yellows. So everything from kind of emerald green to spring green to chartreuse or lime green are all being affected by the green slider. The aqua slider is affecting the cyans, but also bleeding over into the greens. Okay, blues are affecting the violets as well, and affecting the cyans, and so on. You can play with this to your heart's content, but this gives you an idea. So that's the purple slider, which is clearly affecting the blues as well. So it gives you an idea of these sliders. There is quite a large color overlap between the different sliders, so you just need to be careful about that one. Okay, before I go into just processing images, I'm just going to mention in passing, only very briefly, there's this thing called the zone system, which you might have met before. Our mate Ansel Adams, who knew a thing or two about black and white. The reason I'm mentioning this, I'll make this available because it's a very useful kind of reference chart to have. What he did was to split up the set of tones into 11 tones, going from 0, meaning pure black, to 10 in Roman numerals, meaning pure white. And then each one of them nominally a stop apart in exposure terms. And you put zone 5 in the middle, that's mid-grey. But the relevant ones, certainly for the work that we're doing here, are zones 0 and 1, which are the difference between absolutely pure black and something which is near black, where you can see that there's tone but no texture, and then into zone 2, where you do see a little bit of texture. And this is important because when we come to processing pictures ready for print, you need to be careful between the distinctions between those two. If you want to be able to see tone but not texture, you're into zone 1. If you want to see texture, you're into zone 2, and so on. And there's an equivalent one up in the highlights. All right. Now, what I've done, again, I can make this available. This gives you a rough idea, and this is a kind of a gradient from black at the far left to white at the far right. This shows you roughly where each of those zones falls. This is courtesy of Silver Effects, which has a zone editor built in. And I even worked out what the various midpoints and low and high points were for the various tones. So in a 255 scale, the bit from 250 to 255 would be zone 10, 236 to 250 would be zone 9, and so on, with that being the midpoint. So again, I'm not going to go into that anymore. They're there. I will make them available for anybody who wants them. So let's go to some real pictures. Let's do some real pictures, some real examples. So I've got a whole mixture here. Some are mine, some are from Anne, and I'm going to do them in a variety of different ways using different techniques. So the first one is some Pask flowers, which I imagine she took on Furfield Heath, because that's where the nearest place to us, which are Royston Heath, where they flower. And this is a perfect candidate for using the global color conversion, because a bit like the sunflower, we've got two color opposites, and there is a strong color contrast between the two different bits of subject, between the background and the leaves, which are green, and the flowers, which are kind of purpley magenta. So how would I process this one? This one I'm going to do entirely in Lightroom, just to, in the raw converter, just to prove that you can. So I'm just going to make myself a duplicate, a virtual copy. So how would I start off? Well, I'll start off, first of all, I would probably crop this one. This to me cries out to be symmetrical, so I'm just going to crop that down slightly, which also has the huge advantage of cropping out one of the dust spots. Let me get rid of that. There's a Socking Grape dust spot there, so I'm just going to get rid of that dust spot. Okay, so there we are. So now, before converting to monochrome, my tendency is I'd like to start off with a relatively low contrast image, which nevertheless has a full tonal range. So I tend to start off using, it's less relevant when you're working entirely in Lightroom, but certainly when you're about to take something into Photoshop or into Silver Effects, you tend to want to make sure you've got a good tonal range before you do the transfer without clipping. That's the kind of crucial thing here. We're about to move to monochrome, so the absolute color accuracy is not a big deal. It really doesn't matter. So I'm perfectly happy to go with as shot here. Let's convert ourselves to monochrome. Now, this is one of those cases I happen to know because I played with it earlier. There isn't really a good profile that gives me what I want. I'm looking for, I want the white hairs of the plant to stand out. I want the leaves to go slightly dark, and I want the background to go dark, and I want the flowers, the petals, to shine bright. And none of these, effectively, I would have to shoot through a purple filter. And that's not something that's an option. So I'm going to start. I'm going to stick to the basic monochrome, which is not terribly exciting. I'm going to stick with that as the basic. So let's give ourselves a good tonal range. So I'm just going to push the whites up, make sure we've got a good tonal range with the blacks. Yeah, pull that back so we're not clipping the blacks. Okay, right. Here we go. So this one, it's fairly obvious what we want. We want to click on that one. We want to push the flowers brighter. So I'm just going to make the flowers brighter by clicking on that. And note that everything which is that same purpley hue, note it's moving the purples and a little bit the blues, has gone bright. And now I want anything in the background, which is the green, to go dark. So I'm just going to pull that down. Now, you're almost certainly going to have to do some kind of localized adjustment, because the chances of being able to get something perfect by doing global adjustments only is going to be close to zero. And in particular, I want those backgrounds to go really dark, but if I do that, then the leaves go really dark too. And that's not something I want. So I'm going to pull that up a little bit, and I'm going to tackle the background in a rather different way. So let's make sure the flowers are nice and bright. That's okay. We can go in and we can play around with the global contrast later. I'm just getting the color conversion right so far. Right, so how would we tackle that background? Well, this is one of those things that Lightroom actually gets actually very good at, because the background here has no detail in it. There are no edges. And as a result, the adjustment brush, and in particular this thing down here called the auto masking of the adjustment brush, actually does an incredibly good job. So what I'm going to do here, I'm actually just going to paint over the background and turn it darker. It's that simple. So let me just reset. If you hold the Alt key down, you can then reset everything. So I'm just going to click on reset up there, turn the auto mask on, I'm going to turn the exposure down. We can play around with the exposure later when we've actually got the mask in. So what I'm going to do now is just paint. And the trick here is to make sure that the crosshairs on the brush never go into the area that you don't want affected. All right, so I've got a very soft brush. You can see the two concentric circles. The outer circle is the limit of the brush. The inner circle is the limit of the 100% effect of the brush. All right, so I'm just going to paint. I'm going to paint like that. I'm going to paint down in between that area. And note the fact that it's not actually affecting the flowers at all. So I'm just going to go in here. Yeah, this is an absolute dream for yeah, Lightroom really can do this job. Now you can do the same thing in here. Note the fact the crosshairs are not affecting any of the area I don't want to be affected. So I'm just going to go in there and paint that one. I hope I'm not mangling Anne's picture. As I say, I'm fairly sure it's roughly like this that she processed it, fairly low key, but with the flowers really standing out, particularly all the hairs on the stems. So let me just go through, paint all that one again, paint that bit out. And this is one of those cases where the auto masking works incredibly well. It really does. It's just one of those things. It doesn't in others, and we'll see that soon. So that gives me yeah, it's not bad. And having done that, you can then go in and you can play around. You can adjust the background as you want it. Now's the time to start going in and doing some global adjustments. So we could try, for example, let's just see whether we've got the contrast. On the whole, monochrome pictures tend to work better with higher contrast. So I'm just going to push the contrast up. Monochrome pictures also like micro contrast, which essentially is clarity and texture. So we can play around with that a little bit just to see if we can add a little bit of that. But you can also go in and do some selective adjustments. So here I'm going to, for example, I want to add some clarity and a little bit of brightness into those leaves down at the bottom. Push the exposure up, maybe put the clarity and the texture up a little bit, and I'm just going to paint into. Now I've overdone that. You can see that I've overdone that, but not a problem, because all we have to do now is just dial it back a little bit. Just take the exposure back, take the clarity back, take the texture back, and so on. All right, so you can then, of course, go in and you can bring out all the hairs on the flowers and things like that. I'm not going to do that here. It would take a long time. But I think you get the basic idea that even using something like Lightroom, and it's apparently quite a difficult job of getting rid of that background, just because of that wonderful thing called the auto masking, it just makes a really good job of it. So that's how you might be able to approach a picture like that one. Incidentally, as I say, this is one of those pictures that works really well in color too. This is kind of what it looks like in color. You may want to darken some of that down a bit, but you get the idea. It's one of those pictures that really could be used both in color or in monochrome. So far, so good. So let us just try. We'll do another one. This time I will try and remember to do it. I'll do this one in Camera Raw, just to prove that it's possible to do it in Camera Raw, and it's no different to doing it in Lightroom. So it's our old friend. There's big R. This is up at Horsey on the Norfolk coast. Beautiful seal pup. Again, there's doing global adjustments here. It's going to be tricky because as happens a lot with nature pictures, there's not much color variation. There really isn't very much at all. So let's just see what we can do with this one. So I'm going to bring Photoshop into play, and I'm going to drag the raw file into Photoshop, and that will bring up the raw converter. Now, bear in mind that this has changed. If you're running on an older version of Photoshop, then the raw converter will look very different. Adobe have finally managed to try and unify the interface that they have for Photoshop and Lightroom. So they've moved it so you've got your picture in the middle, you've got all your tools down the right hand side, and they're in menus in the same way, or panels in the same way as they are in Lightroom. Of course, they've named them something different just to keep you on your toes, but never mind, the basic principle is still there and the functionality is identical. So let's tackle this one exactly the same way as we tackled the Pask flower. Note the fact we don't have color and black and white. We apparently have auto and black and white, but of course these are two completely different things. It's black and white or not black and white. Those are the options. So in this case, we're going to choose black and white. The four rectangles, that's the same as before. These are our color profiles. So let's go through and find something that's, I'm looking for something which gets me lots of contrast in the face, ideally. That's quite nice. That gives me lots of contrast in the face. So let's go with that one. All right, so that gives me my starting point. Right, so let's close that one. If I can find it, everything's different. You've now got to find a thing which is back. It's not called close anymore, it's called back, so we'll go back. Okay. Basic panel, let's make sure we've got a white, or close to being a true white, something a bit like that, and let's bring the blacks, something a bit like that. Okay, now, the seal's looking good, but the background is way too bright. We want the seal to stand out. We want tonal contrast for the seal to stand out from the background. So I'm going to go to this thing called the black and white mixer, and it's got all the same controls that you've seen in Lightroom. It's got all 9 of the sliders. So unlike Photoshop, it's got the extra 3 sliders as well, and it's got the targeted adjustment tool. There it is, and all right, place your bets. Is it up and down or left and right? Well, it's up and down. All right, so it is the same as Lightroom. So they made it different. The Photoshop RAW converter is different to Photoshop, just for good measure. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to try bring the background down a little bit. I don't want to do it too much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in and do some localized adjustments on the seal. I want the seal to really stand out from the background. So let's go to the adjustment brush, which is up here. So there's the adjustment brush. Same basic principle, only this time it's a dotted line and a solid line, but the principles are exactly the same. So in this case, I just want to bring up the exposure a little bit. I really want to bring up the clarity because this seal has fur, and scales and feathers really, really benefit from extra clarity. It will bring out all that mid-tone contrast. So I'm just going to try painting down here. We can go in and we can change it later, but let's just see how this works. Let's make the brush a little bit smaller. Let's go around up here, something a bit like that. Now let's just get the contrast. There we go, something a bit like that. Maybe get that exposure up. One of the beautiful things about doing this kind of adjustment is that you've got separate white and black points. So you can play around, so you can make the black point for the adjusted area different to the black point for the non-adjusted area, and the same with the white point. So something a bit like that. So that makes the seal now stand out from its background. The background has gone nice and grey, so it's not intruding at all. And the seal is now super contrasty, super detailed, and that's standing out from the background. And the other thing you can do here, of course, you can go in and you can just brighten up the eyes ever so slightly and add a little bit of extra sharpness, a little bit of extra clarity there. So I now have to find, yes, there it is, the little plus up here, that which was called new in Lightroom is now called plus, and this allows you to create a new adjustment. So in this case, I'm going to use find. Now I want to reset this one. There it is. Reset the select. Everything is just subtly different for no readily apparent reason. So I'm going to increase again, put a little bit of extra clarity. There we are, something like that. A little bit of extra sharpness. a little bit of extra contrast and a little bit of extra brightness, because I'm going to go in and we can actually set the flow to be relatively low, because that means that's a bit like painting with low opacity in Photoshop. We can just gradually build up the effect. Apologies for my dog behind, which is about to go for a walk. So again we can push the white point there, and we can pull the black point, and we can increase the contrast. So that just brings a little bit more life to the eyes. And the other thing you can do in the raw converter, of course, is you can add a very gentle vignette. And there's this thing called the radial filter, which is superb for that. So I'm just going to draw a rough ellipse around my subject, which about there, and just take the exposure down ever so slightly around the outside, and maybe take the highlights down a little bit around the outside as well, and then close that. If I can work out how to close it, which I can't. I don't use this, as you probably gathered. I tend to do all my work in Lightroom or in Silver Effects. So there you are. So that's the kind of thing that we're exactly the same operations, but this time we're doing it in Camera Raw. So let me cancel out of that one. Okay. Right, moving swiftly on. I'm not going to work through this one simply because it is just rinse and repeat. So this is a problem you've got in color. The giraffe really is quite well camouflaged against the background, ignoring the fact we've got slightly overblown areas around the sky. However, if you crop down and you mute the background and then you bring out the detail within the giraffe itself, suddenly you're making the giraffe stand out. So that's the kind of image that maybe didn't work too well in color, but where applying a black and white treatment really does bring it out. Obviously it wasn't like that in reality, but there you really can see all the texture of the giraffe all standing out, and we've even brought out, or you can see all the acacia thorns, everything. It just works really well in monochrome, where it didn't work quite well in color. All right, moving on. One of Anne's images, I felt I had to use this one because she used this one on the poster. Yeah, like I say, hair, scales and feathers cry out for monochrome. They really work in monochrome. This is an image I'm going to do entirely in Photoshop. Simple, because I want to show you it's possible, and also because I want to use a different technique. I want to bring a different technique to play. And the thing about this image is that it really is pretty well all the same color. The crocodile's yellow, the ground is kind of yellowy brown, even the grass is a kind of yellowy green. So trying to use color differential to make this picture work is actually going to be quite tricky. So we're going to use a slightly different technique. So let's take it into Photoshop. Okay, well, the first thing I want to do, I want to try and bring out some of that lovely detail in the scales on the crocodile. And one of the best ways I can think of doing that is and this is a well-known technique, is to use the high pass filter. High pass works really, really well, providing you don't use it globally. If you use it globally, there's a tendency to introduce halos and things like that. But on things like this, where there is large scale detail, it is absolutely brilliant at bringing that out. So I'm going to create, this is a well-known technique. You can look it up on the web. Create a duplicate, go filter, other, and then high pass. You can then move that around, and you want to play with the radius until you see the details that you're interested in. It's the details that matter. That's what, so we are looking at these large scale details. So the radius is actually quite high. All right, so we want these large scale details. Okay, now if you were working in color, you would have to turn that to monochrome. We're not working in color, so it's no big deal here. But the trick now is, having turned this horrible thing gray, is to change the blend mode. And the obvious blend mode to use here is overlay. Now bear in mind that's been applied globally. And tuck it off, and if you can see how that has really brought out the detail on the scales of the crocodile, but it's also brought out all the noise in the background. So we want to apply this. Selectively, and so what we do is we just add a layer mask. Okay, so I'm going to turn the layer mask black. I'm sure you'll be able to see the previous recording on layers and masks if you're not familiar with this one. So I've made it all black. I'm now going to paint with a white brush. So turn that to white. I'm going to put the opacity up to something like 50%. All right, and so now wherever I paint, I will be painting in white on that layer mask. Let's make the brush a bit bigger. And hopefully you should start to see, as I paint over it, you should start to see all that detail coming out. So I'm painting the detail in where I need it. That's the important thing about this one. So we've used the high pass to get the detail, and now we're painting it in where we need it. Okay, so that's got, yeah, it really does look really scaly now. That's in a way that perhaps it was not quite so much before. Okay, what's the next job? Next job is going to be to convert it to black and white. Okay, so I'm going to use that pretty useless black and white converter here and just play around until I get the tonality about right. So I'm just going to, notice it's all the same color. If I try clicking in the background, it changes the crocodile as well. If I click on the crocodile, it changes the background. So these sliders are frankly completely useless. So I'm just going to leave that as it stands. But the important thing is we are now in black and white. But we want to play around with the contrast. In particular, we want to bring out the contrast between all these crevices between the scales and the scales themselves. And the best way of doing that is to use a contrast enhancing curves layer, classic S curve. So I'm just going to pull the shadows down and I'm going to push the highlights up. So that has now added some contrast to the scales. Just ignore the background at the moment. We're not going to be looking at the background. We want to make the background effectively disappear. So we're looking at the crocodile right now. That's looking okay. Again, we want to apply this selectively. So I'm going to turn that into a black layer mask. White paintbrush is already set up, so I'm just going to paint over that. So I'm now painting over where I want that extra contrast increase. Okay. Note that I'm not painting in this area up here, which was already quite bright. I don't want to make that bit any brighter. I'm just working on the middle bit here. Okay, and having done that, we can then play around with the contrast a little bit more, make it however you want it. We can play around with the white point and so on. But the important thing is, so we're gradually building up our layer stack. We started off with the base, we've added extra texture to the crocodile, we've converted to black and white, and now we've really increased the contrast on the crocodile. So the final job is to get rid of the background. And this is a job where doing it in Lightroom really wouldn't work because you've got all these little edges. I don't know if you can see all the bits of grass and things like that. And the Lightroom edge detection will see those and it will stop applying the brush. We want something a little bit cleverer than that one. And in this case, select subject does an astonishingly good job. So I'm just going to go select subject. And there it is. It's selected the crocodile. Hasn't quite got it right. So I'm going to go and take my, if I can find it, there we are, quick selection brush. I'm just going to push that selection up into the top left. Again, you can have a look at the video on layers and masks if you're not quite clear what I'm doing. But I am now making a selection of the, whoops, problem is that it's working in monochrome. That's about right. Okie doke. Just take a little bit away there. All right. Now we're going to select a mask because we need to refine this. So at the moment we have selected the crocodile. We have this kind of disembodied head, but it's not the crocodile we want to affect, it's the background. So what we have to do, there's a little button here called invert. So I'm going to invert the selection. So now we are looking at the background. That's what's going to be selected. Ignore this blade of grass. We'll worry about that when we get to it. So the general technique for this is to make sure we've got a really good edge here. And normally, yeah, the selection is not bad, but if you move the radius, what that essentially says is from that edge, just bleed out and see if you can find a better edge. And if you can find a better edge, then just lock onto it. So I just moved it out a couple of pixels and hopefully that will have found a better edge. But anyway, we don't want a really, really sharp transition. So I'm going to feather it. I'm going to feather it by a couple of pixels as well, just to make sure we don't have any sharp transitions. So that has made a selection of the background around the crocodile. So I'm going to go OK. So now we want to darken that area. So again, I'm going to use a curves adjustment. Because one of the things that curves allows you to do is to take that point there and just drag it down. So essentially what we're doing is we're moving the white point right down. Now this allows us to keep lots, we can still keep the detail, just a little bit of detail in the background, but it's gone really dark. And you can play around with the curves well if you like. There's various things that you can do there. All right, now it looks a bit disembodied at the moment because we've got this head just sitting there and this odd bit of grass. But because this is now a layer mask, I can take my paintbrush and I can start painting extra shadow in. Because what we've done is we've created a shadow and we can add some more. In this case, opacity of 50% is probably a bit high. I'm going to knock that down to 20 just by hitting the 2 key. That turns it down to 20. Make it a nice big brush. Little tip which is really useful: if you want to do a job very gently, paint with the edge of the brush, not the center of the brush. So I'm just going to paint over here, very low opacity. So I'm just going to paint. Note that the center of the brush is way off the side of the crocodile. So I'm just going to make that so that that goes dark. Again, I want to make sure that's dark there. Goes in and that bleeds round. And I can also apply a little bit of darkening around there as well, because we don't necessarily want that to be bright. That's a bit overdone, so I'm just going to go in and paint that in white. Okay, so apologies to Anne for attacking her crocodile, but that was my attempt at trying to reproduce what she did on the example image she put onto the poster. So that's essentially using a mixture of techniques and then masking the background and turning the background into something an awful lot darker to make the crocodile stand out. Okay, so that's done entirely in Photoshop. So let's move on. Okay. Right, we're going to move on to silver effects. This is an interesting one. This is an image that, again, a zebra cries out for black and white treatment. It's a black and white animal after all, and yet if you look at it, everything's basically the same color. It's all taken on that kind of pale brown, pale fawn color that the background has. And so we want to try and make this so that it stands out from the background. That's the idea. We want our zebra to stand out from the background and to stand out from the other zebra behind it. Okay, so what do? Well, you'll get used to this by now in terms of actually processing these images. I've done this before. I tend to leave the white balance exactly as it was. All I've done is push the white point up until it almost clips. Let me just reset this back to where we were. Okay, there was a crop as well. Maybe I won't take the reset. Let me just reset the exposure to give you an idea of what we're doing. So let's just reset the whites and the blacks. So it was a little bit. You can see we haven't got a white point. We haven't got a black point. Looking in the histogram, pull the whites up until we are almost clipping. Pull the blacks down until we are almost clipping, and perhaps look at, in this case, the midtones are absolutely fine. I'm going to leave those, but we've now got our basic starting image. I genuinely don't do any more than that if I'm about to take an image into monochrome. I want a relatively low contrast starting point with a full tonal range. So this one I'm just going to take directly into Photoshop, because I use Photoshop as my host application for doing all the neck work. So I'm going to do something here which I'm going to do on future ones as well. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I'm going to turn this background layer into a thing called a smart object. Now, maybe that's something we'll do in a later session. The important thing about the smart object is that what it does is it protects the pixels within it, and it also allows all filters that operate on that smart object to operate as what are called smart filters. And that means that they work non-destructively. It's more like working in Lightroom. So anything we do to this now will be non-destructive. It will not destroy the pixels. And that's really important. So let's take it into Silver Effects. So I want to go to Filter, Nik Collection, and we'll go, whoops, Nik Collection, Silver Effects Pro. Now, Silver Effects it's been around for a long time. It was originally by a company called Nik. Okay, that's a little warning. I normally have that turned off, but I've left that on so you can see it. It's just telling you that it's working on a smart object, therefore it will operate as a smart filter. That's all it's saying. So I'm just going to say OK to that one. Okay. It was a company called Nik that then got bought by Google because Google wanted part of its output, a thing called Snapseed, and then Google kind of stopped development on it. They made it free for a while, and then eventually a company called DxO took it over, and they're now running it again as a commercial concern. So it's very much software which is alive and kicking, and it's absolutely superb. Now, you can, if you want to, this is how I normally work in Silver Effects. Same basic idea as Lightroom. You have an area of a preview. You have a set of controls down the right-hand side. You can also have down the left-hand side a set of presets. Now, I'm an engineer, and real engineers don't use presets, unless they're my own, of course. But if you're new to Silver Effects and you're not quite sure where, or you're new to monochrome processing, you can have a look down here, because one of these might give you a starting point. It might give you an idea of how you want to process the picture. You may want to go high key, you may want to go low key, you may want to go super high contrast or super low contrast, or lots of texture, or you may want a NAF film border or something. And there's lots of choice here. So if you want to, by all means, have a look there, but do not just take what you're given. These are starting points only. All they're doing is changing the settings of these sliders on the right-hand side, and you can then go in and edit them later. What's really interesting is there are very few controls that I actually tend to use. You've got, normally when it starts up, you end up with all these things with triangles closed, but if you open them, you've got a set of brightness controls, a set of contrast controls, and a set of structure controls. Structure is what Nik calls clarity, and actually it's rather better than clarity. It's also got a thing called fine structure, which works at a much finer scale. We won't, I don't think, be using it today, but it's very, very good for things like cloth, anything like that, or shingle or sand, or anything with a very, very fine texture. Okay, so that's your basic controls. You've also got, I'm going to skip over the selective adjustments just for the moment, and it's got this thing called the color filter. Now, it does have the ability to change the color sensitivity. It's here under the film types, but I have to say I never ever use it within Nik. I do use this though, and this is analogous to working in film days with a colored filter in front of the lens. So you can choose the presets by going kind of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or so on. But actually, I find much more useful is what you've got here is the ability to have a variable filter. So you can actually find the exact color that gets you the contrast that you're looking for. And in this case, it may not work, but let's give it a try. Push the strength up. And now I can actually move the hue along the color wheel until I find what I'm looking for. And I'm looking for something where the zebra really stands out from the background. So it's going to be something like a red or a yellow. Maybe push the strength up as well. So I personally find this significantly better than moving the 6 or the 9 sliders. It just gives you a really, really good starting point. Okay, my go-to control, I have to say, when I use Silver Effects, is this thing called dynamic brightness. And what this does, essentially, it's a brightness control, but it's intelligent. And so if you push it to the right, it will open up the shadows and it will compress the highlights. If you pull it to the left, it will open up the highlights and it will compress the shadows. But it will try desperately not to clip. So in this case, what I'm looking for is a high contrast zebra on a relatively pale background. So I'm just going to push the dynamic brightness up. Don't worry about the fact that our zebra is going a bit pale. We're going to fix that. All right, that's what these wonderful things called control points are for, because they allow you to make selective controls in a way that is so much easier than any other program. So what's a control point? Well, it's a combination of an area that you want to select in and a set of instructions as to what you want to do. That's the whole point of a control point. So, for example, now I'm going to click on that black area within the zebra's coat there. Now I'm going to emphasize here, we are not making a circular selection. What the program is doing, it's going to look within that circle, or roughly within that circle, for pixels which are similar to the color, the texture, and so on of the area where the point is being placed. And bear in mind, although we're looking here at a monochrome picture, this is sampling the color underneath. So if this were on a particular color area, it would be sampling that color as well. So it's looking for things which match in color, tone, and texture. Now, if I open that up, these are all the same controls as we have up here. Brightness, contrast, structure, amplify whites, which is basically just pushing the highlights, amplify blacks, which is pushing the shadows, fine structure, and selective color, which we're going to ignore because we're not going to do any color popping. So in this case, I just want to really push the contrast of the blacks. I don't know if you can see how that was working. What that's done is that's really brought out the blacks in the zebra's coat. And I'm going to push the structure a little bit as well, which is going to bring out the micro contrast. Okay, so that has really brought out the contrast there. Now the beauty is, having got it right in one part of the picture, you can copy that control point by holding down the Alt key, clicking on the control point, dragging it somewhere else, and that will now apply exactly the same to something else. So I'm just going to darken the back a little bit. Let's move it up to there as well. So we've now got the same controls being applied to all the dark areas, and note the fact that it has just selected those areas based on the tonality of where I put the points. So let's do something similar to the pale areas. So I'm going to click on the pale area. I'm just going to push the brightness up a little bit, and I'm going to push the contrast up a little bit, and I'm going to push the structure up a little bit. So I really want the black and the white of the stripes to stand out. Again, I'm going to move that round to other parts of the zebra, and so on. So we've got that. I'm just going to move that onto the main as well. So we've now got, what about the tail? Let's hit the tail as well. Now, the thing is, the selections are not completely perfect because they will sometimes bleed into the surrounding areas. But that's something we can deal with, and something that's more obvious on another image. What else do I want to do? That black tree behind is looking a little bit irritating. It's certainly catching my eye. So I'm just going to take the contrast of that tree down, and I'm going to push the brightness of that tree up. Okay, I'm just going to expand that control point out. So now I am just selecting those bits that I want to make paler. And I can do exactly the same thing to that zebra over there. I'm just making that zebra a bit paler and a bit lower in contrast because I don't want it to stand out. Let's make that circle a bit smaller because it's affecting the ear of the, I don't want to affect the ear. Something a bit like that. Okay, so I have some of these things we can go, and you can't get it completely right in Silver Effects, but you can get it pretty right. So there we are. We've gone in. We have now isolated, or done a reasonable job of isolating the zebra. I'm just going to darken its nose down. Its nose is a little bit dark at the moment, light at the moment. Sorry, just darken its nose down. I love this. This is point and shoot processing as far as I'm concerned. I think it's just such an intuitive way to work. And I love it for teaching, because you really can just say, I want to point at this bit and make it lighter, or point at that bit and make it darker, or so on. All right, so there we are. That's done that work.
Ian, we're up to 5 o'clock, so if you have about another quarter of an hour. So far, I haven't got a lot of questions in. So
that's okay. Yeah, I can go on until midnight, as you well know. So
I do, but I may stop.
Yeah. I know people have got homes. People have got homes to go to. Yeah, some of the others are just. I will just show that if you apply the same technique, you get very similar results. But this is. I just wanted to show something else here. Now we've got this. We've got our zebra here, but the background is still a little bit intrusive. We're still visible. We want to try and push it to be paler, and there's a technique we can use for that one, and it's a technique which is used for all sorts of things, and that is to apply a white layer, a solid white adjustment layer, but in soft light blend. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to make a rough selection of the zebra. Again, let's have a look and see whether select subject does a reasonable job. It probably will. Yeah, it's not far off. I'm just going to improve that a little bit just by going in. I'm going to just remove that. Let's make sure we've got all of the ear, we've got all the mane, we've got the tail. We can go in and we can improve that a little bit up the ground. That's all right. It's close enough for government work. All right. So something a bit like that. So same basic principle as before. Whoops. Slip of the mouse. Selecting mask. We want to operate on the background, so you invert the selection. Just push the radius up, see if we can find a better edge. Feather that edge. And go OK. Now we're going to add a solid color layer. And the solid color we want is black. And you think, yeah, that's OK. And we have a two-legged zebra, and that's not quite what we're intending. However, if you change the blend mode of that layer from normal to soft light, suddenly we start to see the kind of effect I'm after. And that's a bit strong at the moment. So you can just take the opacity of that layer and just dial it back. But because it's a layer with a layer mask, we can also go in and paint on the layer mask. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, black paint, and what we can do now, at the moment, it looks like the base is a little bit pale. You can just paint in and add a slightly darker base. So all I'm doing here is painting on that layer mask, and that is going to take away the effect of the white layer from the base, and it's going to bring it back. Okay, so that's a very, very straightforward way of turning a background pale to make your subject stand out against the background. Okay, right, and the timekeeper is moving me on, so I'm going to move along. Okay, let's find something else. This is one of Anne's pictures. Again, I'm going to do this in silver effects. I don't know whether she processed this high key or low key. I think it would work well as either. I'm going to do this high key or high-ish key. Same basic principle, play around with the exposure. I've already done this to give you an idea. I've just moved the exposure up a little bit, moved the white point, moved the black point until we have a full tonal range and the mid-tones are about right. So take this into Photoshop. Now this particular one was quite a noisy image, so I've actually turned off Photoshop's sharpening for the simple reason that I'm going to use the wonderful new Topaz denoise. Now again, good reasons for doing this, and this is one where I really will benefit. I'm going to convert that to a smart object because I want this to be I want to be able to go back and change this potentially at a later date. So I've protected the pixels that are inside a smart object. So the first job is going to be to do the denoise very quickly. This is not a Topaz tutorial. So we're going to go in, we're invoking a plugin, it starts up. I'm going to do nothing more than hit the auto button and accept what it says, because I say all I want is something that does the job. So that's now removed the noise from the background. It's left us with a lovely sharp butterfly. So I'm going to go apply. Okay. Now, because it's a smart filter, this is not destructive. We can go in and change these settings later if we want to. That's the whole point of making it a smart object. But we can nest smart filters. So having done the denoise and the sharpen, what I'm going to do is open Silver Effects. Nick Collection, Silver Effects. Excuse me, so let's bring that up. Did that actually do anything? Yes, it did. Is it a gatekeeper, Anne? I was trying to work out what kind of butterfly it was.
No, it's a meadow brown, I think.
Meadow brown, is it? It's a meadow grey now. Never mind. Okay, so you've seen all we've done so far is we've done the basic control, but we've got a very, very muddy grey looking image, and we want a butterfly, a darkish butterfly with lots of detail standing out on a slightly paler background. So let's go down to my favorite thing, which is this color filter, push the strength up, and let's just move the hue along until we start to get a good contrast. So if you were to do a low-key rendition of this one, you'd probably want to use something like a blue filter, because that pushes the background dark and brings out the detail on the butterfly. I kind of envisage this as a high key, so I want the butterfly dark against a pale background, so something like a yellowy lime green filter, and I can then push the there we are. I can push the filter. So you really can get that separation just by playing around with the filter. Okay, that's got me quite a long way just by playing around with that color filter. My friend Dynamic Brightness, push it all up because I want to go a high key. I want that background to be lovely and soft. But what that's done now, of course, is it's made the butterfly too pale. We want the butterfly to be darker and stand out against the background. And that's where control points come in. Take a control point, plonk it on the butterfly somewhere. Note the use of the technical term plonk. Make it so it covers the entire butterfly. And what we're going to do is, well, same as before, we want to increase the contrast. So I'm going to push the contrast up. And I'm going to push the structure up because this butterfly is covered in little droplets of moisture, and that essentially is texture. And the structure slider is really, really good at bringing out texture. Okay, so something a little bit like that. We can try amplifying the blacks a little bit, maybe amplify the whites as well. So we've now got a high contrast butterfly wing standing out against the background. What else? Well, the head's looking a little pale, so I'm just going to plonk a control point down here on the head, make it a little bit smaller, because what I want to do here really is pull out the contrast, and I really want to amplify the blacks. I really want to make those blacks sing. I want that head, so maybe even bring the brightness down slightly on the head so that it stands out against the background. So something a bit like that. And the other thing I want to do is maybe have a look at this this grass head. So, and if you noticed, it went a little bit darker there. That's because I've put another control point down, which is kind of acting as a blocker to this control point. So I'm just going to push the brightness of that up a little bit, and maybe add a little bit of contrast and a little bit of structure, and that is being applied to that grass head. I'm going to copy that control point, Alt copy. That's a little bit bright at the moment, so I'm just going to take that brightness down and do the same thing. Put that down there somewhere. So it's all the same kind of brightness level. Now, what you might have noticed is that some of the conversions that I've done, some of the changes I've made, have actually bled around to the outside. And the trick to get around that is to put what are called null control points. So this is a control point that's actually doing nothing, but it acts as a boundary, because essentially when you've got two areas covered by two different control points, then Silver Effects has to work harder to work out where the boundary is between those two. So it's now got rid of that bleed. And all I'm doing is copying that null control point all the way around the image. And if you can see, what it's doing is it's removing some of those effects that I put in. So they're not doing anything. These things they're just acting as blockers to stop the effect. Okay, So I'm not going to take that any further other than to point something out, which is that having converted it to monochrome, you now see this. That was there in color, obviously, but I'll tell you something, when you process into monochrome, you are going to find things like dust spots that you've missed. And this used to give a real problem. I'm going to hit OK, because having done the monochrome conversion, you then want to go and remove that dust spot or remove that blemish. And if you hadn't worked as a smart object, you've had no choice but to do that conversion, that cloning or that removal of the dust spot in the black and white domain. Now, because it's a smart object, we don't have to do that. So we've got this thing, we've got the pixels for this picture, the original color picture, remember, wrapped up in a smart object. So if I double click on that smart object, it reopens it. Now again, covered in the last session we had, removal of that is actually very straightforward. Create a blank layer, patch tool, all right, content aware, sample all layers. So I'm just going to draw very roughly around it. That is where I want the target to be, and I'm going to tell it where the source is. Job done. So we've got rid of that distraction. I'm not going to go into the ethics of whether this was the right thing to do. That's well above my pay grade. I'm going to leave that to other people. The important thing is we've now got the smart object here, and we've created a new layer within it, which has removed that blemish. So when I close this smart object, and you do that by going File, Close. All right, and we go, yes, I want to save the changes. That is now rewrapping everything. So we had everything wrapped. We had the original smart object, and then we had the denoise, and then we had the silver effects. It's reopening this. And I'm going to go, yeah, I want to keep exactly the same settings as before. You could change it if you wanted, but I'm keeping the same settings. So it's reapplying those. It will then reapply the silver effects. And hopefully in a second, what you should see, yes, it will now you know, even with a relatively powerful computer, it's doing quite a lot. There's a lot of pixels here for it to work on. So it's now doing the silver effects, reprocessing. It's saving the image out, and there we are. So we have actually removed that. We've removed it without having to do any cloning in the black and white domain. We've gone back and done it in the color domain, and it means that anything like the denoise and the silver and the black and white conversion has been done exactly the same way. You know, as you don't have this boundary between what's color and what's monochrome. Okay. I'll show you another couple of examples, which I won't work through, but just to show you that what is possible. So yeah, this is another image where similar technique to the zebra. So we've got it's quite this was an astonishing thing to watch, an elephant and a buffalo having a standoff and kicking up a lot of dust. It works quite well in color, but in monochrome you can really make the animals stand out from the background, and again that uses the white layer technique, but at a relatively low opacity, just to push the background so it's pale so that the animals stand out from it. Another one here, another R picture, our old friend the baby elephant. This is just using, this is using essentially not color, but contrast. So the processing here is to add texture and to add contrast to the elephants, but to remove texture and remove contrast from the background. So we end up with this three-dimensional effect. So now in black and white, you've got an image that stands out much better against its background than it did in color. It also brings out, this is, an elephant's skin is ideal for black and white because it brings out all that lovely texture. Okay, this is another one of Anne's. Again, it's all the same color. So using the color sliders is not going to give you a particularly good job. However, of course, if you then take that into silver effects, what you can do is you can push the background pale, you can bring all the texture out in the elephant's skin, and you can also bring out all the texture in the dust bath, because it's having a dust bath at the moment, and make it much more obvious, the darker dust against the paler background. So that's another example of really using black and white to make a subject stand out, where in color everything is roughly the same basically, so you can make the subject stand out. I've got one more which I'm going to show you as this is a slight tongue-in-cheek. There's one final thing I want to mention before I finish. This was an evening shot. Marabou stork sitting in a tree. It's basically, it was backlit. It's essentially a silhouette. So why not make it a silhouette? There's nothing which says in your black and white processing you can't just make it a complete silhouette. It may not win any prizes in a nature competition, but I actually quite like that. I think that's great fun. Right, one final thing I want to mention before we go to questions, and that is the thorny issue of toning. Now, at the moment, everything I've done so far has been using true monochrome, one color, and that color is black. Where you have monochrome, it's normally black plus it's assumed that the background will be white paper or something. But if you enter an exhibition or a competition, there will be definitions of what constitutes monochrome. And usually that means that you're allowed to have one color, but it doesn't have to be black. So it can be brown, it can be blue, it can be green, it can be red, it can be whatever. What you're not allowed to do normally is to have part of your image one color and part of your image black. That would be deemed, or even a different color, that would be deemed to be split toning. And split toning would make your image a color image, not a monochrome image. So very quickly, I'm going to show you some very quick ways, and it is very quick, to show you how you can tone. So this one, for example, doesn't matter which image we use to do the toning. Let's use the Pask flowers. Why not? So you can tone in Photoshop. I'm just going to open that image in Photoshop. There it is. Toning in Photoshop, you've got various different ways. One is to use the black and white converter. Interestingly, it's very good at this. If you go to black and white, obviously it's not going to have an effect because there's no color there. However, there is a little button called tint. And if you click on tint, you can then choose a tint that you want to apply to the image. And that's guaranteed to be global. So that one is safe. That is guaranteed to give you an image which is monochrome friendly. So that's one way of doing it. So that's quite a nice way. Another way is to add a solid color layer. So I can add a solid color, and this time I'm going to choose the color I want to tone with. So maybe that color, something like that, and set the blend mode to color blend. Now the beauty of doing it this way is you can then play around and you can move your color around and you can see what it looks like, and you can change the hue and you can tone. Ooh, that's nice. Maybe not.
Not for me.
Maybe not. But you can play around. And again, that is guaranteed to be safe because you are absolutely applying the same tone all the way across. All right, so that's another way of doing it. And a third way, depends on obviously your workflow, but another way of doing it in Photoshop is to use hue saturation. Hue saturation has an option called colorize. And colorize allows you to choose a hue. So we'll go here, something like that, and then a saturation. So again, that is guaranteed to be global, and that's guaranteed to be monochrome safe. All right, so 3 ways in Photoshop. So those are all safe ways, nothing to do with the supermarket of the same name. So let's look in Lightroom. Now Lightroom, and indeed in Silver Effects, you've got a bit of an issue you need to be careful of. So let's just go into, let's take the same image. Lightroom has a thing called split toning, and indeed it is split toning. Split toning is where you put a different color in the highlights compared to the shadows. It's an effect which is absolutely gorgeous. It can produce some absolutely superb results. However, be aware that if you choose to do that, then any image you produce will not be deemed to be a monochrome image, or it's likely not to be a monochrome image. It's likely to be a color image. So just be aware of that one. So a true split tone would be where, for example, we were to put a something like a sepia filter or sepia into the highlights, something like that, and we were to put, let's just take the saturation down, that's way too high, and we were to put something like a blue tone into the shadows. So I'm going to choose blue, something like that. Now again, that's way, way too strong. So I'm going to take the saturation right down. So that gives you something like a blue sepia split, and you can then play with the balance. So if you move it more towards the shadow, the blues will creep up in the tonal range. If you move it more towards the highlights, then the sepia will creep down in the tonal range, but you'll still have two colors. You'll have, in this case, a sepia, and you will have a blue. So that is a split tone. You have to be very careful with that one. If you want to make them exactly the same, what you need to do is you need to copy these values. So 52, 35, if I make that 52 and 35, then we are now applying exactly the same hue and saturation to both the highlights and the shadows, and that is safe. Okay, all right. And the very, very final thing you will be pleased to hear, very, very, very before Anne shoots me. So let me just reset that one. Set the saturation down to 0, because what I want to do is just take that one into. I'm going to take that one into Photoshop. Silver Effects has exactly the same problem. In that, if I go Filter, Net Collection, Silver Effects. So let's start that up. The toning here is, and there's some absolutely fabulous, the toning in Silver Effects, along with everything else, is absolutely brilliant, but you need to be careful. It's under Finishing Adjustments down here. So you go to Finishing Adjustments, and it's under Toning. Now, just like Lightroom, it's got two sliders and a balance. So you have to be very, very careful as to what you do here. In particular, you've got to be very careful if you use the presets, because the presets, it has things which it calls split toners, but it then has ones which it calls it implies are non-split. But if I, for example, choose that sepia, you will find that the hue for the silver, and this is aimed at darkroom workers. That means the blacks or the shadows is at 30 degrees around the color wheel, whereas the paper hue, which is the highlights, is 50 degrees around the paper wheel. In other words, they are different colors. So if you choose these presets, you are inadvertently split toning. So if you want to be absolutely sure, what you will do is you will change that number to 30, and you'll even change the amount to be the same. That was 33%, so you can just type a number in, 33%, and so on. So again, you can play around with those, you can play around with the balance, but just be careful, because if you're not careful, you will end up producing an image which is split toned and therefore not monochrome. And here endeth the lesson. I'm sorry I overran, Anne. I always do.
No, it's fine, actually. You're just about right, because we haven't got a lot of questions in at the moment, which may mean you've completely baffled everyone, or you've answered everything. But
well, it could be either, couldn't it, really?
It could, yeah.
It
So
could be.
Maggie has a couple of questions. One was when you were doing the seal. If you're
Yep.
adding clarity to the seal, would you also add texture? Do you always add them as a
I'd see which one works best. You've got to do it on an image by image basis. I don't. Each of them are doing something slightly different. Clarity, as far as I know, is doing a programmatic high pass. So effectively, it's like doing a high pass filter. So you can, the more clarity you add, the more detail, micro detail you see. Texture, let's just give it a try. Let's give it a suck it and see. Let's add something, and so if I were to add, let's add just texture and see what happens. And that's pretty horrible, isn't it? Let's tone it down a little bit. All right, maybe not. And let's try adding just clarity. Yeah, they're clearly doing very, very different things. Texture, I suspect, is working at a greater scale, at a larger scale. I think you have to suck it and see. I tend to assume that texture is for larger scale stuff, and clarity is the micro contrast, the smaller scale stuff. But just suck it and see. That's the beautiful thing about doing this kind of work, is it's down to interpretation.
Okay. Maggie's also asked about whether the white layer method would be acceptable in most nature competitions, and she says, I suppose it depends on rules, and I think that's the answer, really. I think if you're doing competition work, you have to be careful on that personally. And but I think we aimed this talk also for people who want to do some.
Yeah, it's a difficult one,
artistic
because
things.
where do you draw the line between what's done by adding a white layer and what's done by doing selective bright lightening and darkening?
Yeah,
Where's the boundary?
it's always a difficult one, isn't it? So
Yeah.
I don't know that that's something you just have to make up your own mind on. But certainly techniques like this are applied widely to nature images, and then they're put in, well, for the RPS, they're put in fine art category if you're going to do a distinction, or in an open category if you're going to do a competition. So I think we were aiming this at wider than just a nature competition.
Sure, and even just on your wall, do what you like, do what suits you.
Right, Kev has asked, when taking an image from Lightroom to Photoshop, you selected Edit Original. Do you not use some of the options like lens corrections and some basic settings first, and take Edit Copy with Lightroom adjustments?
Okay, that's a bit of a red herring, and the reason it's a bit of a red herring is that because these are example images, some of them are JPEGs and TIFFs.
Yeah.
You can only really apply things like lens adjustments to raw pictures. Like that one, there's a raw picture, and if I go, if you edit that in Photoshop, if I can find that one, then you don't get an option to edit anything other than with Lightroom adjustments. So you only saw that pop up because I happened to be working with examples that were JPEGs and TIFFs. It's just a side effect of how I worked.
Okay, and I think the last one, unless then you was adding one at the bottom, which I'll look in a minute, would the workflow equally apply if your starting point was an infrared? Now, we've got a talk coming in December on, among other things, infrared photography. So obviously we'll interest in people that way, but what about processing?
Yeah, the one thing I would say about, no, I have an infrared camera, as indeed Anne does, and that camera still shoots color pictures. They happen to be bright red, but it does shoot color pictures. Now, you can apply a color profile to that, which removes the horrendous red color cast, and it leaves you with an image which has got a little bit of blue and a little bit of brown, usually, when you subtract all the red. Now, the one thing I would say is I often convert my infrareds to monochrome, but leave the color there, particularly if you're going to take it into silver effects, because silver effects can make use of that color information when it's making its selections. So leave the color there. You may even decide to kind of push the color slightly if you are aiming for an infrared monochrome, so that it gives something, so it gives silver effects something to get its teeth into when it's making those selections. So yeah, keep the color, get rid of the red, although I don't suppose silver effects would care very much. But
No, I go straight in, personally.
Sorry?
I go
You
straight in.
Straight in with the bright red one.
Yeah, I do with silver effects.
Yeah, as far as it doesn't care about what the absolute color is. It's only looking for similarities, color similarities. So if it goes in bright red, fine. It's going to convert that just fine to monochrome. Yeah. So yeah, but start with color. Don't change your camera to shoot black and white. I guess is what I'm saying. I'll start with the black and whites. Start with the color, which of course you will do if you're shooting raw.
Okay, and then we've got one, somebody's asked about will the recording be available. Yes, they're all available. When you get the, you'll get an email with that on. You'll also get an email, in the email, links to wherever we've put these documents, the charts and things that Ian's promised. What else? And the last one, do you now prefer Topaz to Nick noise removal now?
Yes, I do. It's better. It is better. The one thing I have to be a little bit careful because it tries to do two steps in one, and usually it does a good job. It tries to do both the noise removal and the sharpening. Sometimes it doesn't quite get that right, and I still do it in two separate steps. But usually I'm blown away by it. It's an astonishing piece of software.
Okay, well, you know, it's exactly past, and I haven't had to say it's time to stop. So
No, no, well,
very
that makes a
much.
change, doesn't it?
Thank you very much, Ian. That was really interesting. It was a little bit off maybe the subject of the natural history distinction type of work, but it's obviously a subject that we want to air. If you have any other suggestions, I mean, if you'd like a session, maybe a slightly more dedicated audience, and I don't know whether it includes me, on smart filters, let us know. Or we were wondering about blending modes in general for doing some of the utilities like removing halos, but also again some of these more artistic things. So if when I email you, you would let me know some of the things you're interested in, we'll arrange some. Otherwise, there's a very long program now on the Nature Group site. We've got quite a lot of outings and quite a few talks coming up. Particularly the next one being the Chairman's Day, which promises to be a really interesting day. Also has the AGM. And we've also now got confirmation that the Natural History Advisory Day is taking place on Saturday, November the 28th, and by Zoom. And we will be opening to observers again. The places are filled as far as we know. Nobody's dropped out yet. But if you let me know you want a session, then when we've got enough people being interested, we'll arrange another one with Bristol. So, okay, thank you very much, Ian. You go and have a well-earned.
No, no, you're very welcome,
Yeah.
as always.